another underlying theme that's in here is that the devil is trying to undermine love, but also the devil hates fertility, and the devil hates women because they are fertile. And I've heard exorcists say this. I bet you have too, because you're so explicit about it here. You know, that the demons are envious of women because we can give birth and they can't. They don't even have bodies. They can't do that. And so they're always attacking that about women. Talk a little bit about that and the different places that shows up in these letters. Samantha Stephenson, welcome to the Dr. J Show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm excited about your new book. You were a guest of mine about 3 years ago for your first book. And this new book of yours is very clever in a way, but creative, I would say. It's inspired by the Screwtape letters by C.S. Lewis. What made you want to revisit his brilliant idea of demons writing letters to each other in order to make a point? What brought that to your mind as a vehicle for saying what you had to say?
Well, my husband and I reread the Screwtape letters every Lent. Well, I shouldn't say every Lent because I don't think we have started that this Lent, but we read it a lot together, and it's became part of our language of talking to each other and challenging each other as spouses. Like, hey, I think that Screwtape talking, like, you're getting a little off track, is a humorous way to challenge each other a little bit lovingly. And I was invited at one point to write a testimony for our local Idaho Catholic Women's Conference about why you should come to the conference. And the things that came through my mind were like, these are all the reasons people come up with of why they shouldn't go. Well, you know, I can't because this, I can't because that. And my husband and I call it, like, a lot of the times getting a case of the twos, like, oh, I'm too busy, I'm too tired, I'm too this, too that. And so what I ended up writing for them was a Screwtape letter about all the reasons why, you know, how the enemy would get in your mind and tempt you from attending this event that could lead to your spiritual refreshment. And so it kind of grew from there. I started making notes in my phone of, whoa, there's another temptation that I had, or there's another way that works or plays out. If, you know, I hear things in women's meetings or just from friends. And so I made a lot of notes in my phone. And then as it grew, I realized, okay, I want to get into this. I want to dive into this because, I mean, C.S. Lewis is brilliant. It is the number one spiritual classic for a reason. It definitely stands the test of time. The main character in that book is the patient, they call him, is a newly converted Christian. And I think that those letters are important for everybody. And if you can only read one book, definitely pick that one. But at the same time, I think there are things that could be said in our modern context, specifically for the way the feminine heart and just the challenges that we encounter as mothers and as women that I was able to flesh out and address. And so I think the book kind of reads like an examination of conscience, but in a really disarming way through this lens of fiction, which he was so brilliant to come up with.
Well, and so that was going to be my next question. There's something about this format that has been very effective over the years that has, as you say, stood the test of time. And why do you think it's important to revisit that format and use that format in today's day and age in particular?
Well, I think that an examination of conscience in particular, it's a really useful and important form of prayer to go over, you know, invite the Holy Spirit to show us what are the things that we could be doing better. Where did we fail? So we can invite grace to help us do better. But sometimes it's a little bit challenging to turn the mirror on ourselves and really do that examination, or it's just hard to remember, or it's hard to understand how things work. So I think that what Lewis did by bringing this into a fictional context to kind of show the way, he's just so psychologically brilliant. And I think that's why the letters have stood the test of time, because the times and the context has changed, but really the human heart hasn't changed all that much. The way in which we're tempted, I mean, there might be new tools for temptation, but we're pretty much, our virtues and our vices are what it means to be human is constant. It just plays out on a different stage. And so having fiction and seeing all the ways like, oh, this could play out, or whatever the particular temptation is, how does that little voice whisper to you? Or, if you aren't tempted to one extreme, how can you be then maybe tempted to the other, right? Because virtue is the midpoint between two extremes. So being able to see that, I think, one, that fiction is disarming, and that it helps our imagination. And it's just another way besides our reason and our moral conscience. Fiction helps us to really, readers are really empathetic people. When you do read fiction, you learn to identify with these characters. So as you're identifying with the character in the story and you're being empathetic, then you kind of realize, oh, that's actually me. I see myself in that. And that's uncomfortable, but actually the whole thing here is the devil tries to trick you into, instead of recognizing that and asking for help and just saying, oh, okay, I'm limited, I'm little, into this cycle of pride and shame and like, oh, I did something bad, so now I have to hide and not ask for the grace. And you can actually play that fully out without it being your own personal emotional thing. So I think that is helpful too, because people can recognize, oh, I have compassion for this person. It's not the end of the world that I've had this moment of weakness, because that just really means I'm human. So then I can ask for the grace I need to turn things around.
Well, and also it's always easier to see it in someone else than it is to see in yourself. And so in this fictional setup that Lewis pioneered and that you are building upon for a new age, the reader is invited to look at another person, the fictional person, and go, oh, I see how the apprentice is going after this character. And that could be me, if somebody's whispering that in my ear, I could see how that would be tempting and how I might succumb to it and so on and so forth. But it doesn't have the pressure of you looking at yourself. And a lot of times, especially I think in our age, people are particularly immune to actually examining their own consciences. We have a lot of finger pointing and
we like to examine everyone else and see what they are doing.
That's right. And so this is a device. This is a literary device that helps you. That Bill actually uses that in a constructive way, right? Because you're looking at the character, but the character is meant to reflect back on you. Who is the client or the patient in this case? You said that for C.S. Lewis, Wormwood? Was that the name of the?
Yeah, Wormwood is the tempter, and then
is the tempter. Yes. And your tempter is called. Who is your tempter?
In this, Bellbind is the tempter, and the name Bellbind comes from this. This is the flower. This is the leaf. It's a weed. We can get into the symbolism of that more if you want. But the advisor is Boomslang, and that also is symbolic if we want to talk about that. But.
Yes. But who is his client? Who's the patient? Who is he tempting? Who's he tempting?
The patient is a Catholic mother who is trying to live faithfully. So a little bit different than a new convert. This is somebody who's been a part of trying to live the faith for a while. And obviously being a woman and a mother just has more.
And it's focused. Yes, it's focused on a particular set of temptations that are particularly potent in our particular day and time, don't you think?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I'm living in our day and time, so I'm living the life of the patient. So it's inspired by the things that have probably always plagued mothers, and then the things that are particular to our time, like the screens and things like that.
Yes, and there's so much angst around these conversations. I'm going to share something that happened to us here at the Ruth Institute. In an attempt to get beyond the pro-feminism, anti-feminism stuff, to just step away from all of that, I put a post up on our page saying, hey, ladies, let's talk about our husband's masculinity. What do you admire and appreciate and respect about your husband's masculinity? And I went first. I said, my husband is the kind of guy the guys borrow tools from, and he fixes things, and I feel safe, and I just lean into that. And I love that. That's what I said. That's the kind of thing I was inviting. And Samantha, people went bonkers just immediately talking about toxic masculinities like that. It's like that came out instantly. And I'm like, oh my, I mean, honestly, I wasn't ready for it. I mean, we have a lot of trolls at the Ruth Institute. That just comes with our territory, I guess, but still, I was shocked by how fast and how vicious, and I'm thinking, how are we ever going to have happy married life if so many women are scapegoating half the human race, basically, and I'm like, whoa, let's talk to Samantha about this. So that represents a major temptation for a lot of people, maybe not for a homeschool mom of four in Idaho, but then maybe so, I don't know. So tell us a little bit about some of the key temptations that you thought were important to explore using this literary device.
Yeah, well, so I think that one of the differences between the Screwtape letters and this book is in the Screwtape letters, I think the primary arena of temptation is sort of this world of ideas, of society, and then there's a minor note of relational temptations. And I think that this book flips that, and I think rightly so, for a book that's more about a man versus more about a woman. Her temptations are primarily within her relationships, and then societally is still present and still part of it. But looking at temptations that play out in friendship, the letter about friendship is the longest. None of them are particularly long, but that one just had a lot to be said about it. There's these temptations to gossip and how that destroys friendships, to the fear of vulnerability and how that keeps us from being able to make real human connections. I think that actually might be worse in our time. It's hard to say because I haven't lived in any other time, but I do think that the way we live our lives makes it easier to hide and harder to connect in real life with those kinds of things. Then there's temptations with her children, in her relationship with her husband, her mother-in-law. That's a big one that you hear that phrase, oh, my mother-in-law. So I wanted to hit on that. And really, that's kind of that character of the mother-in-law as a stand-in for anyone who is in your life. It could be any family member, or it could be a friend, could be a boss, a colleague, just someone who's in your life. You have to deal with this person and they're challenging. So how does that play out? In this character is really tempted to sort of take everything and make it the worst possible, like everything through this lens of, it must have been done because of the worst possible reasons, instead of what St. Ignatius advises us, which is to always presume the good. Just whatever people's actual intentions were is sort of beside the point. Just take everything as though it was the best possible intention. And I think that Ignatius offers us a great way to approach relationships with other people. And then she's tempted, of course, to the opposite. So those are some of the examples. There's a lot of things in there.
Now, you've said a little bit about this, but the Bellbind letters, how does your book differ from the Screwtape letters?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think being not just a newly converted Christian, but somebody who is going through it, I think that's kind of an exciting or an interesting way to look at temptation, because when you are, I've had the experience of converting. I grew up Christian, but I converted to Catholicism in college. And so when you have a moment, whether you're just finding your faith for the first time or you're recommitting to your faith, some people are falling away and then recommit. There's a period of time where you have this like mountaintop experience and you're on fire and you're really passionate about it. And there are certain temptations that are particular to that period of time. But then once that falls off and you're sort of in more run-of-the-mill life as usual, I think there are different temptations that creep in and different, I guess, once that has the initial loveliness falls away. It's true about relationships too, right? It's not just our relationship with God. It's especially in the infatuation stage with a certain partner, you have like all these lovely feelings. And so there are certain things that are going to be more trying during that time in your relationship. And then once you are ready to be in it for the long haul, there's different things that are going to come into play. And even just the loss or the change of these really magical religious feelings or these really magical falling in love feelings to really what it takes to build intimacy. And I think that's
over the long
the
haul.
one.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think
over
it's
the
one of
long
the
haul. Yeah.
analogies in the Bible for a reason, that this marriage relationships. I think it is a good analogy for the intimacy that God offers us.
Yes, and the difference between the honeymoon phase and the day-to-day life phase applies both to religious experience as well as to love life experience, your romantic life, your the daily life of your marriage. And I've been married. We got married for the first time in 1984. We had a civil ceremony, and then we got married in the church in 1988. So we've had a long marriage, and I can tell you that it does deepen. You don't have you do have some hilltop moments,
Mm-hmm.
but what you have is something it's just deeper. I don't know how else to put it, but it's just a kind of deepening respect and appreciation for the other person. And you go, wow, this guy, and you realize Christ died for this guy that I'm married to, and so therefore he's of infinite value. And I'm now seeing more and more of
Mm-hmm.
that infinite value as we are, continuing in relationship without falling into all these temptations that Bellbind is trying to lure us girls into. So you have I think it's fair to say you have an overall message to Catholic moms, but because you're being literary about it and not didactic about it, it's coming across in a different way.
Yeah. Let's read.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, can I tell you, one of my favorites was when you described marriage, the importance of marriage in Bellbind's Planned. The demon has some strong feelings about marriage, which you talk about at the bottom of page 89 and the top of page 90. Maybe you have another place you'd like to go, but I like that part. I personally like that. But by the way, people, this is what the book looks like, so you must go buy it. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. All right. I'll start with that paragraph. We have a veritably endless trove of tactics at our disposal to destroy spousal love, and so much the better. The enemy has seen fit to create marriage as a reflection of his own communal nature. Thus, it must be the central thrust of our attack. We cannot have his ideals reflected clearly into the world. We must distort and twist them so that the original attraction remains intact, but the execution leads them further from his designs for them. We have made a great headway via our messaging on marriage as the gateway to personal fulfillment, and in leading spouses to destroy each other, the institution of the supposed love, and the security of their offspring, the security their offspring find therein.
So just to be clear, when this book says the enemy is
Yes.
God.
Right.
Okay, so the demons are always referring to the enemy. Yeah, the enemy is God, and the institution of supposed love. So he's like sneering at the idea of love.
Yes, they don't believe in that.
And he says, this girl is influenced by theology of the body, okay, because she's saying it must be we cannot have his ideals reflected clearly in the world. What that's saying, translate from the literary into the kind of more theological, is that the institution of marriage is an image, is a reflection of the love of God's communal nature. And so for the evil one to break that up, all day long, he wants to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because God is a unity of three persons and an exchange of love, like this community of love between persons. And we are meant to reflect that fidelity and forever kind of love. And we fall short.
Yeah. And so that last sentence, go back to that last sentence and unpack that for us, because it's showing the temptation that he's throwing out something that looks good, but isn't really good. So
their messaging, like their propaganda to us through our culture, is that marriage is the gateway to personal fulfillment. So one way that this plays out is that as spouses, we see marriage as the way to happiness. We see our spouse as the source of our happiness. And so we end up idolizing our spouse and thinking that our spouse is there to give us happiness, and thinking that if we are not happy, then therefore there's something wrong with the marriage, or mostly there's something wrong with that spouse because they are not fulfilling that desire. And that's really painful, because our the longing there, the true and good and beautiful thing that we are attracted to, is we're really longing for God and for God's love to satisfy us and to fulfill us and to make us happy. And so when we try to search for something that's infinite in someone that's finite, that's really painful to be the finite person who's trying to satisfy this thing that they are ultimately never going to be capable of satisfying, because they're the wrong person to give you that. The person who wants to give you that is the person who made you.
If you insist that your spouse be God, you can't let God be God, and you can't let your spouse be human,
right?
Yeah. And then we turn around and do that to ourselves as well, and think, well, I'm God because I'm right all the time. That's the way. That's the inverse of that, is that we see ourselves as being perfect. We can't see our. But you've got.
Yes, my husband can tell you that's true about me.
Well, honestly, it's not rocket science, because it's pretty universal. You can observe that. And, in fact, our book, my colleague and I wrote a book called 101 Tips for a Happier Marriage. And on the frontispiece, it says, God is God. Your spouse is not. You are not. That's like the whole book is that, in one way or another, coming out with it. You also have some, I would say, wise things to say about children and not idolizing the child. Do you have a favorite? Any favorite passages about that you'd like to share with us?
I'm not sure which chapter that is in, because there's one that's on children, and then there's also one that's on motherhood, and there's also one that's like on the mass, and this woman who's taking her kids to church and just overflowing with the proof that she has that she's so much better than everybody else because her children are all, beautifully dressed and neatly done, and they're quiet and behaving well at church. This is not a problem I have like that. I don't suffer from that because that's not my family. Our problem is more in like finding enough matching shoes to get out the door. But that is one way of, our kids, seeing our kids as, this is proof that I am worthy because I'm finding my identity in how wonderful my children are, which sort of then objectifies the child. And that's not really where we should be finding our identity. It's important to give ourselves in love and to be, serving other people, but they are not proof of our own worthiness or unworthiness. So there's, to sin just means to miss the mark. So anytime that we get off track in either direction is making that mistake. So that definitely, when we're using our children as proof of our own worth, or, on the opposite side of the spectrum, thinking, oh my gosh, my kid is like messing up so much, I am bad. That's a trap that we fall into, but that's not, their performance as a person is not proof of our worth or lack of worth, and our relationship with them is a good way to give and to serve, but it's not the source of our goodness or our identity.
There are a number of places in here too where you basically where the demons are talking to each other about how to make her resentful, how to make her dissatisfied, how to just make her think she's deserved. I highlighted one. And the enemy is God, and our father below is Satan. Okay, so if you see that language through here, we would talk about our father above, but they're talking about their father below. Something I'm looking at right now. I'm looking at page 78. That was a good one too. And then this one, page 74, where you're talking about fertility. You've got some parts in here about she has a miscarriage. At one point in the book, and the demon's talking about how we can exploit this miscarriage. How can we get her upset, or how can we use that effectively? Talk a little bit. I don't know if you want to quote it, but talk people through that a little bit, because this is an experience a lot of people have, and I think a lot of people will be able to relate to the various temptations to discouragement and so on that are inherent in that. So tell us about that. Hey, a quick shout out to our sponsor, realestateforlife.org. This is the most pro-life, pro-family way to buy or sell a home. Go to realestateforlife.org. You'll be connected with a Christian realtor. Part of their commission will go to the pro-family charity of your choice, the Ruth Institute, for example. And it costs you Nothing at all. It's the most pro-life, pro-family way to buy or sell a home. Go to realestateforlife.org.
Yeah, well, the letter starts first off by the senior demon is cautioning the younger demon who's being a little overly triumphant about like, oh, this is a miscarriage. Like, great, our patient is suffering. And the senior demon says like, hold on here, because it really matters how she responds and where we go from here. Because yes, they think, gosh, it's hard for me to talk like them. They think
I
it's
know.
great that there's no longer this image of the enemy in the world. Like the fewer fleshlings, the better. But on the one hand, that's good. But if she responds to this by drawing closer, because one of the things that happens in suffering, I think people who have suffered a great deal often testify to this, is that suffering forces them or allows them really to draw closer to God and
Yes.
to feel his presence all the more deeply. So the fear that the demons have in this is that, well, what if that happens, and then their focus then is, how can we keep that from happening? So if we keep whispering, things about mistrust of the enemy's plans, he doesn't really, it's really the original lie all over again. Oh, God wants to keep this good thing from you. Don't trust him. He doesn't really love you. If he really loved you, he couldn't do this to you. And to whisper those things to really lure her away from that opportunity there, which is to draw closer to God, and to that she is being invited, when tragedy happens, we're invited into radical trust in God.
Yes.
And sometimes things happen in our lives and it's a choice. Either we walk away or we have to do something heroic, and there's not really a midpoint. And so that's the enemy's fear, is that we will do something heroic, and their whole thing is just sow the seeds of mistrust and division in that, whatever the tragedy is.
Do you know, recently I read an article about Shia LaBeouf, who had, some kind of legal meltdown in Mardi Gras in New Orleans and got arrested and, get this big blow up. And somebody was interviewing him, and he basically said, I messed up and Jesus is still Jesus, even though I'm an idiot, or something like that. And somebody wrote an article and they called it dirtbag Catholicism. The real gritty, nitty gritty of the Catholic faith is when you're a mess, when you're at your absolute worst. The highly polished, airbrushed thing is not, that's a dim shadow of the whole thing. It was pretty interesting, actually. And I could see the guy's point that there's something admirable about a man doing something terrible. I mean, he didn't kill anybody, but, just really losing it and saying, yeah, I was a dirtbag. I'm wrong. To just say that. I mean, we don't say that in our world today. I was wrong. It was me. It was my fault. Another underlying theme that's in here is that the devil is trying to undermine love, but also the devil hates fertility, and the devil hates women because they are fertile. And I've heard exorcists say this. I bet you have too, because you're so explicit about it here. That the demons are envious of women because we can give birth and they can't. They don't even have bodies. They can't do that. And so they're always attacking that about women. Talk a little bit about that and the different places that shows up in these letters.
Yeah. Well, can I read a quote?
Please.
Okay. So one of the ways it shows up is by basically we want to have control over our fertility, and that could be we want to have control over amassing as many children and as many babies as we possibly can because we want more kids, or we just desperately want one kid, please God, and so we want to have that control, or we want to have the control to place barriers and to stop our fertility, and we want to be the ones in charge of that. And so this is a line about contraception. So pervasive is this pesticide that they have come to view their default fertility as switched off, as we so desperately wish it to be, and rightly regard each new life as a pest who has broken through their rightful barriers. So that that line is just meant to convey exactly what you were saying about this view of wanting to create as much of an impediment to new life as possible.
Right. Every fleshling, they hate flesh. They hate the incarnational fact that we have bodies and that Jesus had a body. And
because the spiritual, in their pride, the spiritual is above the material, and so anything that has material aspect to it is polluted and filthy. So they call the incarnation, in the book they refer to the incarnation as the abomination. That's partly why they hate Mary so much, because as the Queen of Heaven, she's a human, a fleshy woman. She should not be above them in the created order because they are pure spirit. And so that's part of their revolt and why they hate Mary so much. And they're just filled with hatred. And I think that's partly why we get Gnosticism, which is an early Christian heresy that just keeps coming, right? We just have, right now we have people who deny that our flesh is who we are. They deny that we can tell that we are male or female based on the body that we have, even though every cell in our body is male or female. Like, we know if we're male or female. And there's this idea that, this flesh is all just, an illusion, and you really are whoever you think you are. And that is just a modern form of Gnosticism.
Yes, 100%. And it's a resentment of the body in a lot of cases. The whole sexual revolution, which is what we talk about all day long over here, the whole sexual revolution is resentment of the body in one way or another. Can you explain to us now the symbolism of the names of the characters that you gave them? Tell us, remind everybody what were the names of the characters in the original Screwtape letters, and then tell people about the names you gave your characters.
Yeah, so the original, the senior demon tempter is Screwtape, and the junior demon is Wormwood. In this book, the junior demon is Bellbind, and that is this is what the attractive Bellbind flower looks like, but it's actually a very demonic weed. I chose the name because I battle this weed in my garden season after season, trying to remove it. This is a little bit of a different weed because usually weeds, if you pull something out by the roots, then that weed is gone. You've dealt with it. This weed spreads by rhizome, so through the roots. So you can pull it out. And what actually happens with this is you try to pull out this weed and it grows back more heads, like that mythical creature, the Hydra. You cut off the head, it grows back more. So when you're fighting it, it just comes back and fights all the more. You can remove all of the greenery and everything from the surface of the soil, and it still will grow through the roots. It will grow under concrete. It will grow up to like 30 feet deep. And what it does is, in your garden, it takes these little, I don't know if it comes across on the camera, but it takes these little tendrils and it wraps them around everything else in the garden. So it tightly chokes out whatever it is. So you can't pull it without pulling up the fruits. And so if you're pulling it, you're going to pull out, that's the gospel, the weeds with the wheat, like you let the weeds grow up because otherwise you pull out the wheat. And so what it does because it's taking the nutrients out of the soil by being interplanted with your crops, and you can't remove it, or you remove it, it grows back more vigorously. It reduces crop yields by up to 50%. So in thinking about this tempter that is really difficult to battle, keeps coming back, will live under the soil, even if there's no light for years and years and years, will still kind of be creeping under. But like our temptations, is really pretty and attractive. The other thing that's really interesting about it is that it cannot thrive in good soil. So one of the ways to battle it is by amending the soil and becoming good soil. And we know from Jesus' own words, he uses that metaphor of we need to become the good soil and let the fruits of the Spirit really thrive. The other thing is, if you plant a lot of other things and you put a lot of other roots, it will kind of slink off from the populated area. So if you're planting, think of your soul as like a garden, and you're planting virtues in your garden, then that can kind of ward off a little bit from the danger and the temptation of the Bellbind, or bindweed is its more common name, but at Bellbind is more poetic. So we chose that.
And it's a great metaphor for the way temptation destroys life within the soul.
Yeah.
And so for in that way, it's a rather apt name for you to give to your, but this is the apprentice demon, right? This is not
right. So that's the
who's
apprentice.
the boss man.
So the author who's penning the letters is Boomslang. Boomslang is actually an African tree snake. So you've got the symbolism of the snake. But what's interesting about this particular snake is it is so venomous that if you are bitten, you can't just go to the hospital and get an anti-venom treatment. You need that. You must have that. You actually have to have a full blood transfusion in order to be able to survive. So
wow.
I loved the symbolism there of we are attacked by the snake, and we have, in order to survive, we have to have Jesus's blood, transfused mystically within our lives. Yeah.
Whoa, that's amazing. That's amazing. That you came up with that.
Well, there was a lot of back and forth with my editor and the publishing team, and there were lots of names floating around. I had a lot of friends who were floating some names. Their names appear elsewhere in the book, but we went back and forth a lot, and I love the symbolism of this name, and everybody got on board. There was a little bit of pushback because I guess the word boomslang appears in the Harry Potter books. But we decided ultimately that she didn't invent the African tree snake, and she didn't have, it wasn't a purely Harry Potter thing. It just happened.
Yeah, and she didn't own it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So, but this isn't the symbolism that of the blood transfusion. I think.
Yeah. No. That's very potent.
Yeah.
That's a very potent set of images right there. And this is a time to mention that you actually have two books that have come out in very close succession. The other book is a gardening book, right?
Yeah. Yes. There's actually more reflections. I just got these in the mail yesterday. There's more reflections on Bellbind. If that wasn't enough spiritual reflection on this one read for you, there's more in this book, and among other things. So it's practical, spiritual. I call them seeds of contemplation to set the tone for the season, and then what chores you might do, how you might care for the garden to steward abundance in that particular season. So it's Ora et Labora, the prayer and work of gardening.
There you go. So that's great. The completely different book, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Additional publicity for Samantha Stephenson, the amazing.
A good way in the temptation to be disembodied people in society is very strong in our culture. So this is a good way to touch grass, to grow gardens. There's a lot of tips for gardening with young children in there. So to raise little gardeners, to understand the spiritual metaphors that Jesus gives us. He used a lot of agricultural metaphors. So, it's on topic.
Very salt of the earth, very, very earthy kind of a topic. I want to go back to C.S. Lewis, okay, because you mentioned to me when we corresponded about this that C.S. Lewis found it disturbing to assume the character of the demon and to put himself into the mindset of the demon. Did you notice anything like that for yourself?
So I don't know what this says about me. But no, I did not. I actually found it to be really edifying. And it is disturbing. If I were to actually be saying the things that are written in here, they're sacrilegious because it's the demon talking. But for me, seeing the amount of force and the vehemence and the hatred of the opposition, I think I have kind of an argumentative personality. So seeing the force against things that are so holy just drives home for me how beautiful and sacred and holy and important these things are. So I found it to be empowering, and I'm hoping the reader finds that to be the case as well, just to say wow, if this is how much they hate the rosary, I'm going to be picking that up more often. If this is how much they want to keep us away from the Mass, if this is how much they want to keep us away from reconciliation, I'm going to go every week. I really hope that it leaves the reader fired up to double down on their faith.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, was there anything else that of particular interest that you noticed in yourself as you were writing?
Um, well, so I would say that it came from like lots of years of noticing different temptations, and becoming more aware of them. But I think it's definitely been a journey of growing in humility, because just because I was aware, am aware of them and notice them, doesn't mean that I'm any better in being able to battle them or overcome them. And so that in itself, I think, is actually a gift. And I think it was a gift that I wrote these two years back to back when I was actually doing the drafting of them. And so I think that was a gift, because in this one I got to really see and how all this stuff is playing out, and recognize not all of these, praise God, not all of these are my personal temptations, but the ones that are, I got to see those and recognize them. And then over the course of a year, realize I'm not any better, especially on my own, not at all good at battling these things. We have to ask for the grace, but grow where you're planted. The phrase is about growing wherever you are, in whatever, on your back patio or in your full backyard or on acres of land. But it also ended up in the spiritual reflections coming out to be that it was a gift to be able to write, because God was saying that about our souls, wherever you're
Yes.
planted, wherever, it's about my perfectionism. So as an author, that was a gift, because I think first and foremost, when we're called to these types of work, it's something that God wants to work in our own souls. And so that was definitely a gift for me of, here's temptations, and I am not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to come to me as you are and allow me to do the sanctifying and to give you the grace for that. So.
And to bloom where you're planted. You
Yes.
are a woman of a particular age in a particular time and place. And he did not put you in the Middle Ages. He put you here today.
Right.
And he gave you something to do. And whatever that is, that's what you're supposed to bloom and do. And I think that's very beautiful. That's a very helpful thing. When you and I first got acquainted about 3 years ago, you were on my show 3 years ago, and we were talking about another book of yours about motherhood.
Yeah.
Your main thing in your training is in bioethics.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about your work in bioethics, and your you have a project called Brave New Us. I think that's the name of your Substack page, if I'm not mistaken. Brave New Us.
The podcast is Brave New Us. The Substack is Choosing Human. It would have been easier to make them both the same name. That's probably. But so I like to say I write about faith and family and the future of being human at choosinghuman.org. And then the podcast Brave New Us is really zeroed in on that being human part. And specifically, there's a lot, when you say the word bioethics, there's a lot that encompasses. It's the ethics of medical care. So that could be like patient-physician relationship. There's the ethics of death and dying, of beginning of life issues, and then also emerging, research and emerging medical technologies. And so that is kind of my area of focus, is looking at technologies like genetic editing, stem cell research, reproductive technologies, and what are those things doing to really shaping who are we becoming as human beings, who are we becoming as a human community. So I interview experts, researchers, everyday Catholics who are affected by these issues. And so it really depends on the episode, kind of what you're going to get. Could be about mini brains grown from stem cells, or it could be about how to deal with infertility. It really just depends on what we're talking about that week.
But does this come out every week?
It's every other week right now. Is the cadence that where I am planted is doable for my family, and I'm homeschooling our 4 kids. So that's my primary focus. My main vocation is marriage. My responsibilities are in our home. And so this is just kind of what God does with, this is like, I like to think of it as I give God my loaves and fishes, and then these are those leftover baskets kind of spill out.
That's a great analogy. But I think for women, something people seem to not understand. When you explain it, they get it, but it's taken us a long time to sort it out. The idea that women are supposed to be the same as men, for a long time, people thought, well, we have to get in the labor force, and we have to work in the same way and according to the same plan, the same age earnings profile, and all of that has to be the same. And that just doesn't work for us if you have your little ones, you know. And so for us, I think it's easier and beneficial, really, to name it, that there are seasons of life for us as women. You know, this is the season of your life that you're really focused on homeschooling, your husband, your home, your children. That season is gone before you know it. You know, you're in the fun years right now. I just want to say that, everybody. These are the best years when your kids are home and little and everything. You know, those are the best years of my life, no question about it. You know, but then there'll be a new season, right? And then new season, that all of the work that you've been doing, that you've kind of kept your foot in the game a little bit. You know, you're keeping up with some of the people and literature, and that will come to fruition and flower at the right time if you, as you say, give God the loaves and fishes, and then he'll do whatever he's going to do with it.
Yeah. Having something on the other side will be a nice consolation prize for the sorrow of all the birdies leaving the nest.
Yeah, well, you know, that's very true. That's very true. I remember when our daughter graduated from Berkeley, I remember we were up there for the weekend for graduation, the whole thing, and I was depressed the whole weekend because I realized she's not coming home. She's never coming home. It's never going to be the same. It's like, you know, but you know, now she's married and I have a grandbaby, and you know, all that. That's the new season. You know, it's the new season of life, and that's the way it should be. So I think we've already mentioned now the places where people can find more of your work and so on. Do you have a newsletter or anything like that people should sign up for? Where can people find you, Samantha?
Well, my newsletter is at choosinghuman.org, but all the links to everything can be found at my author website, which is snstevenson.com, Stevenson's with a PH. So all the links to purchase the books or look at the podcast, that's wherever podcasts are found, Brave New Us. Everything is on that website.
And do you have any final message or any final words that you'd like to share? Is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't ask you that you'd like to say in closing to the Ruth Institute followers?
Gosh, I just thank you for giving your time and your attention today. I think that attention is probably one of the most valuable things that we have to keep a grasp on the way that we spend our attention and our time. So thank you so much for spending your time with us today and listening to this conversation and supporting the Ruth Institute and using your attention and voting with your attention for things that really matter. Thank you.
Samantha Stephenson, it's been a pleasure to reconnect with you and to talk with you about your really marvelous book that I think is going to be very helpful to a lot of people, the Bellbind Letters, Inside the Devil's Plan for Your Motherhood. Thank you so much for being my guest on today's episode of the Dr. J Show.
Thank you so much for your kind words and for having me. It's been a great conversation. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for watching. Since you're a fan of the Ruth Institute, you should really sign up for our free e-newsletter. We'll send you a free download of our report refuting the top 5 gay myths. It's filled with our unique combination of personal stories and nerdy data. You can click on the footnotes and be taken directly to the references. It's totally free, so sign up at the link below today.